the architecture of power hidden in plain sight. Most people believe power announces itself through titles, through authority, through force. But the most durable power is rarely visible at all. It surrounds you quietly, guides behavior subtly, and feels so normal that it goes unquestioned. That is the architecture of power. To understand why this matters today, we need to rethink what architecture actually does. Buildings do not command. They shape movement. Doors invite or restrict. Corridors guide flow. Walls decide who meets and who never does. Power learned this long ago. Among the world's most influential sheiks, architecture is not aesthetics. It is strategy made physical. At first glance, the structures appear functional. Government complexes, financial districts, cultural landmarks. Nothing overt, nothing aggressive. But look closer. Entrances are selective. Distances are intentional. Visibility is carefully controlled. Who waits? Who enters? Who is seen first? These details decide hierarchy. Before a word is spoken, historically, power relied on enforcement. Rules were declared. Boundaries were guarded. Compliance was demanded. But enforcement creates resistance. Architecture avoids that problem entirely. When environments shape behavior naturally, people comply without realizing why. They adapt. They internalize limits. The sheiks understood this deeply. They watched how open spaces encouraged gathering, how narrow access created dependence, how separation reduced friction. Power stopped issuing commands. It redesigned environments. Financial centers were placed strategically. Residences were positioned for distance, not proximity. Meeting spaces were engineered to control tempo. Time slowed or accelerated, depending on who entered the room. This is why power feels effortless. It rarely needs to assert itself. The structure does the work. But this architecture is invisible to most because it does not look like control. It looks like order. And order feels neutral. That neutrality is deceptive because once architecture decides outcomes, debate becomes irrelevant. Negotiation becomes symbolic. Resistance becomes inefficient. This is the opening truth. Power today is not imposed. It is embedded. And once embedded, it becomes almost impossible to remove without dismantling everything around it. But architecture, like all systems, faces pressure when the world changes. And the modern world is changing fast. Speed, transparency, mobility. For the first time, the architecture of power itself is being tested. What happens next depends on whether structure can adapt without becoming visible. Because the moment people notice architecture, it stops working. And that moment is closer than most realize. As the world accelerated, invisible architecture began to strain. Digital spaces collapsed distance. Remote access weakened physical gates. Mobility disrupted fixed pathways. The structures still existed, but their influence softened. Power responded by extending architecture beyond buildings. It moved into systems, platforms, procedures. Physical design merged with digital design. Access was no longer controlled only by doors, but by permissions, by credentials, by invisible thresholds. Who could log in? Who could approve? Who could escalate? These were architectural decisions, just without walls. Among the sheiks, this transition was intentional. They understood that architecture must evolve or lose relevance. Financial flows were routed through controlled choke points. Legal frameworks defined movement more than borders. Urban planning blended with data planning. Power became hybrid, yet the principles stayed the same. Shape behavior without issuing commands. Guide movement without confrontation. But as architecture expanded, its complexity increased. Systems overlapped. Authorities blurred. Responsibility diffused. This introduced fragility. When no single structure controls outcomes, coordination becomes essential, and coordination depends on trust. That trust was tested when disruptions appeared unexpectedly. A platform outage, a logistical failure, a regulatory shift. Small interruptions created outsized effects. Observers began noticing patterns. Delays clustered in specific places. Access failed predictably for certain actors. Advantages persisted despite disruption. The architecture was becoming visible through friction. And visibility is dangerous, because once people feel structure, they start mapping it. Once they map it, they search for leverage. The sheiks recognized the risk immediately. Architecture could no longer rely on permanence. It had to become adaptive, not fixed, not static, but responsive. The next evolution would determine whether power remained embedded or became exposed. And that evolution would require something architecture had rarely embraced before: uncertainty. Uncertainty had always been something architecture tried to eliminate. Clear paths, predictable outcomes, stable flows. But predictability creates maps, and maps create vulnerability. The moment structure becomes reliable, it becomes exploitable. So power inverted its approach. Instead of guiding everyone the same way, architecture began behaving differently, depending on who engaged with it. Access was no longer binary. It became conditional, contextual, adaptive. The same door opened faster for some, slower for others. The same process produced different outcomes, based on invisible variables. This was deliberate. By introducing uncertainty, architecture stopped being readable. Patterns dissolved before they could be mapped. Those outside the system felt friction. Those inside felt flow. And that difference mattered, because power is not about blocking everyone. It is about smoothing movement for the right participants. Among the sheiks, this philosophy expanded rapidly. Urban design integrated flexible zoning. Financial systems adjusted thresholds dynamically. Regulatory frameworks allowed exceptions without appearing inconsistent. Nothing was random, but nothing was predictable either. This frustrated challengers. Every attempt to identify control points produced contradictory data. What worked once failed later. What failed suddenly succeeded. Leverage cannot stabilize. At the same time, insiders adapted intuitively. They learned the rhythm. They sensed when movement was allowed. They adjusted behavior without explicit instruction. This is a subtle genius of uncertain architecture. It does not explain itself. It trains. But uncertainty carries risk. When systems feel arbitrary, legitimacy weakens. Trust erodes. Participants question fairness. The line between flexibility and chaos is thin. The sheiks understood this danger well. Uncertainty could protect power, but it could also destabilize it. The challenge was balance. Enough unpredictability to prevent mapping. Enough consistency to preserve trust. That balance would be tested when pressure demanded clarity. And clarity in uncertain systems is always expensive. The next moment would force a decision, whether to reveal structure or let uncertainty absorb the shock. And that decision would define the future power, hidden in plain sight. The climax arrived without announcement, because architecture never announces change. It simply redirects movement. When pressure demanded clarity, the structure did not explain itself. It absorbed the demand. Uncertainty did the work. Instead of revealing rules, the system allowed multiple outcomes. Some paths narrowed, others widened quietly. Observers searched for consistency. They found none, only results. That was the breakthrough. Power no longer depended on stability. It depended on adaptability. By refusing to clarify architecture, the system avoided being pinned down. By refusing to standardize response, it avoided being gamed. Those who belonged adjusted instinctively. Those who challenged exhausted themselves, trying to find patterns that no longer existed. This resolved the tension. Trust did not disappear. It relocated, not in predictability, but in reliability of advantage. For those inside the structure, that was the revelation. The most advanced architecture does not promise fairness. It promises function. It moves the right people efficiently. It delays others indefinitely, and it does so without visible force. The resolution is unsettling. Power hidden in plain sight. is no longer something you confront. It is something you navigate. You do not overthrow architecture. You either learn how to move within it, or you remain outside it. This is why modern power feels everywhere, and nowhere at once. Why it resists attack. Why it survives reform. Because it is not a person, not a policy, not a decision. It is an environment, and environments do not argue. They do not defend themselves. They simply shape what is possible. That is the architecture of power today. Quiet, adaptive, unavoidable. And once you see it, you begin to understand why. Changing outcomes has become so difficult because power was never standing in your way. It was guiding you around it.